Hi, and welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. On today's show, we head straight to Tasmania. That's right, the home of the koala. And we're proud to have along with us Jenny Kyng, a registered nurse, professional counselor, as well as a psychotherapist. Jon and Jenny today are going to discuss a variety of topics on gender care. Now, Jon, let's bring you into the program today. How are you, sir?
Brad, I'm good. Thank you, as always, for hosting this. We couldn't do it without you.
You're very welcome, sir. I know that women and children are being manipulated through gender affirmation and gender care. What do you think the future looks like, Jon?
Well, the future doesn't look good if we don't do something to stop what really is a juggernaut. As I've referenced before, this is the greatest man-made psychological ruse, scam, and scheme ever foisted upon parents and children that are very vulnerable, the vast majority of whom have serious mental health issues. They are being mentally and emotionally groomed. We used to call that brainwashing. It is not just a North American issue. It is all around the world. This is a global issue, especially in Western world, Western civilization. And that's why I'm very thankful that Jenny Kyng from Down Under, I think that term probably, is that applicable, Jenny? Welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement. Jenny, you and I became acquainted with one another, and I found your social media posts to be spot on and resonating with everything I was saying. Especially, it was as though I was hearing my words in you as you were saying, this entire movement that is targeting and manipulating and exploiting vulnerable kids, this is man-made. This does not exist, but the marketing has been so successful that most people think these things are real, these terms, trans kids and other things. So Jenny, welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement. You are a seasoned therapist. You have done groups, you've done individual, and what's so important as well for this discussion, you have worked with a population of troubled young people that have eating disorders, and that is one of the 9 red flag clinical indicators of sexual trauma, and that's what's so concerning, among other things, in my estimation, that is what's so concerning about this grand deception, the trans movement, those that are pushing it, because it is causing clinicians of all groups of people, but physicians and clinicians, since we are mandated reporters, it is causing professionals that should know better to reframe serious red flags that should cause us to begin to ask serious questions. It's causing us to reframe things in terms of gender when that causes us to turn a blind eye to what are probably the indicators of much more serious indications. One of those inevitably are eating disorders. So Jenny, welcome to Unmasking the Trans Deception. Tell us about your concerns and what caused you to become concerned.
Okay, Jon. Well, I was following woke culture for some time, and starting off with critical race theory, which I found toxic and very nihilistic and divisive. And then hot on its heels came gender identity ideology. And having worked with young people, especially young women, I immediately noticed that this was dangerous, false, unscientific, and an absolute trap for all the young people out there, vulnerable young people, like you say, many with trauma, who are looking for some chance to escape being themselves. And this is like this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. All you have to do is go through this, what is an horrendous process, and you will have a new you. You'll be someone different. It's very cult-like in many ways. And so I was immediately alerted and alarmed. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry, that's how I got involved in it.
No, that's right. Well, you've just referenced it now. What are your concerns? So talk to us. You're talking to parents, you're talking to grandparents. You may very well be talking to young people. So that's a wonderful thing too, because you'll be able to help educate them, share your concerns. But let's talk to parents. Let's talk to grandparents. Let's talk to concerned citizens. Let's start with, what are your concerns? Where do you see the dangers that that come from this, that stem from this. So talk to us about your concerns because there's a lot, and we're going to get into some of the myths, especially the dangers, the medicalization. That's a huge part of this. You cannot separate how kids are being medicalized, and that's part of what concerns us. So talk to us about your concerns.
Right. Well, my concern to begin with, or one of the most fundamental parts of my concern, is having been a registered nurse for over 30 years and coming from a family with a few doctors in it, that there's no scientific basis for the initial diagnosis. I mean, we started off with gender dysphoria. Now that's a description of a feeling. But then we have transgenderism, which is a description of an entity, and that entity does not exist. Nobody is born trans. People make themselves trans through surgery. But there is no innate biological condition of transgenderism. And that's what this is all being sold on the basis of, that there's some innate condition called trans or transgenderism, but there is not a scrap of evidence that that condition exists. So we're starting off on a false basis. And in science, if you start off on a false basis, you're going to get bad results. And that's what's happening. So we're starting off with that terrible basis, a lie, a huge, huge lie that's gone around the world, as you say, and has taken in so many young, vulnerable people and their parents and doctors and health professionals and therapists as well, who, like you said, they should know better. They don't have an excuse as far as I'm concerned. The children have an excuse, of course, because they're being exploited. And the parents also, they're being not just exploited and conned, but threatened that if they don't go along with this, terrible consequences will ensue. So my concern is that we're doing horrific harm to young people on the basis of a complete myth. I would call it science fiction. We're doing horrific harm. We're taking healthy bodies and damaging them irreparably and irreversibly. And we're also taking healthy minds and damaging them, again, irreversibly. And yes, there's no excuse for it.
Right. And you reference cult. This has all the earmarks of a cult, right? There's certain methods, there's certain ways of recruitment. And Jenny, I have shared in the past, and prior to our recording this, you referenced something. So I'll say what I have shared on social media and in recordings and interviews that I've done, that to really understand the power of what's going on in terms of manipulation, because that's what this is. Kids are being groomed. Now, what do I mean by that? They're being manipulated. They're being worked. Their intuition is being overridden. So they're being unduly influenced. We used to call it brainwashing, but we'll call it now mental and emotional manipulation. And what I have said in the past is to properly understand the power of the trans deception, of the trans movement, and those that are pushing it. You really need to understand the best of cult-like, time-tested cult-like techniques and methods of grooming. That means they're targeting kids of recruitment and retention. And the best that I know of is the former sex cult called NXIVM. That was billed as a self-improvement organization. That was Keith Raniere and Allison Mack, right? And it comes to find out that it was almost human trafficking, that Keith Raniere was a tremendous cult leader. Allison Mack was helping them. They were charging boatloads of money, and there was a group of them. So we can draw even an additional parallel. So you have the larger group paying a lot of money, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. A lot of people paid Keith Raniere a lot of money to do self-improvement. A lot of it was to enhance business and their own personal business prowess. But within that group, there was a little cadre that Keith Raniere with Allison Mack and a number of other people were running this thing, and they kept their eye out for potential recruits within recruits. And they had this little inner circle, and it was, really after you kind of drank the Kool-Aid and those running NXIVM could watch, they knew that there was this element of they idolized Keith Raniere. And so you have an emotional investment, an emotional, they captured the emotions. So then Allison Mack and the others would come along and say, hey, you know what? Keith really sees potential in you and he wants to help you take it to the next level. So they became part of this small little group. Little did the women know, they became a harem. And so there was an initiation, right? But look at what happened to these women. And there's a book called Scarred, a woman out of Canada, that after the fact, a very similar thing to detransitioners, they cannot believe, how did they end up being manipulated? But what's ironic, if somebody goes on to look at NXIVM, it's NXIVM, I believe, what you'll find is they took reasonably intelligent individuals, adults, and so manipulated them that the inner sanctum, that inner group, these women, were willing to lay down on a table and subject themselves without anesthesia to body alteration. They would take a cottering iron, a woman physician did this, and they branded them near the groin area. Well, it had this weird design. And of course, they're being sold that, okay, this is the extent to which you're going to show loyalty, and it will just really prove that you're part of the inner circle or the family. Little did they know, they were branded with Keith Raniere and Allison Mack's initials.
Yes.
Talk about the similarities. So what I say is this: if you want to understand the power of the trans movement, the pushers and what they're doing, and how these people get these kids in, get them sucked in, you study what happened with NXIVM, and you study what happens with Scientology. Certainly other cults, but those two utilize some of the best and most effective of time-tested cult-like methods of manipulation and recruitment and retention. You have referenced that yourself.
Exactly. It's very cult-like. And even when you listen to adult detransitioners, people who transitioned in adulthood, they were susceptible to these same cult-like techniques. They fell into a group of people who believed in transgenderism, and their partner might have said, hey, I think you've got gender issues. Then they see a therapist, and the therapist says, oh, how long have you been dressing like a man? You know, this is what they said to Scott Nugent, who's very well worth listening to. He was 46. But if you go back to children, we're looking at this indoctrination, and that's the only word for it, starting from preschool or even earlier. Because everywhere you go now, there's the rainbow flag, and there are constant, we're barraged with messages about pride and trans, and, it's never ending. But children are starting on this track very, very early. They're being told from the earliest ages that they can change gender, that they might be a different gender, that if they're not stereotypically female to the point of being like Barbie, which later on, when they get a bit older, turns into a porn version of Barbie. If you're not like that, then you're not really a girl. And if you're not like G.I. Joe, and they're telling them this from very early ages, like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, then you're not really a boy. So you're being told from a very early age that your body is wrong. Now, what a horrifying and terrifying message for a child. Children's imaginations are so vivid, and they're terrified of something happening to their body. So to tell them that their body is wrong, and their body's even dangerous, and their body's going to do terrible things if it's left to its own devices, that's a very cult-like message. And it's absolutely horrifying that children are being exposed to this by teachers. And then, should they end up in the clutches of a therapist, unfortunately, the vast majority of therapists are going along with this stuff, as are the vast majority of the medical institutions, the medical organizations. It has affected every area of society. Every institution, virtually every single institution, is now captured by this mythology, this science fiction. And yes, so it's like a kind of societal cult.
Well, you mentioned science, and I think, there's the science hasn't really been proven here. They're let's face it, children's minds haven't developed, children's bodies haven't developed. They're not, they haven't gone through puberty. they're not thinking clearly at that point. There's a lot of confusion growing up along the way as to who you are, how you fit in, what your background is, where you live. Again, I still say that some of this becomes racial profiling in a sense, and it's profiling not only the kids, but it's profiling the parents, it's profiling the therapists, it's profiling the doctors. We're all being labeled in some sort of a way, and that's a troubling factor going forward, that we're all being labeled. And the World Economic Forum will have you believe that, they want to herd us all like cattle. So they label us all, they pigeonhole us all. They're going to decide, where we're going to work in the future and how we're going to eat in the future and how we're going to, get along in society in the future. And that's concerning. And this indoctrination doesn't just start at the school level. It doesn't just start at the government level. This is coming from a different place, from a different part of the world. And it hasn't just started. It's been evolving since, a very long time ago. And you talk about the indoctrination process. It goes back to not just the DiEM-5. It goes back even farther than that. And that's part of the history of this movement that I think that at some point Jon and I are going to have to delve into and really look at how we got here and, what we can do to, I guess, educate our own kids. And it has to happen from parents. Parents have to be the ones taking that initiative to educate their kids. The teachers, they're not on our side at this point. They have been already touched by this movement, and they believe that it's a positive, worthy effort. But the reality is, just keep it away from our kids, right? So I don't really have a question at this point. I just thought that I'd bring that up because I think that there's something there that the science isn't science-based, much like Scientology or the Scientology religion isn't science-based either.
I totally agree, Brad. It's not science-based, it's science fiction-based. The idea that you can be born in the wrong body is, on the face of it, absurd, and it's almost medieval. It's an extraordinarily primitive idea that your body can be wrong and that there's some part of it that is right. There's something in there that is right. If your body's wrong, well, I ask the question, well, what is the right bit that's trapped in this wrong body? And it's this, nebulous concept of an identity, which is basically sort of like a soul or a spirit, and I ask the question, why are surgeons removing body parts to make a body conform with something as nebulous and esoteric and ephemeral as some sort of spirit? In other words, just a feeling or a thought or a belief. And as you said before, children are very imaginative. They can't tell reality from fantasy. That's part of childhood. They're a bit like a psychotic person cannot tell reality from fantasy. And that's a normal state in childhood. We cannot really differentiate reality from fantasy well. So if you start feeding fantasies to children, they will just lap them up. They will absolutely.
I always wanted to be Aquaman, and I always wanted to be G.I. Joe, and I always wanted to be something, It wasn't...
Right.
I didn't want to necessarily put a dress on and start dancing around, but those are kids just acting as kids, and that's part of the growing up kid process. And let them find themselves without indoctrinating them into this evil plan that transitions these kids into a place that 30, 20, 15 years from now they're going to scratch their head and go, "Why did I do that? Man, I'm really confused and troubled now."
Exactly. If we started telling children from an early age that they had an alien living inside them and that we needed to operate to get the alien out, and showed them that movie Alien and had a whole lot of other doc, they would all believe it 100%, because children, unlike humans generally, all brainwashing experiments have never worked, but we can certainly brainwash kids. We can indoctrinate children because they've got a largely empty slate, so we can write anything on it.
I always tell my kids, be smarter than your parents.
Yeah, that's a good thing to say. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And when you said it'd be interesting to trace the origins of this, that would be a fascinating program, because you can go back to John Money and Alfred Kinsey, and a lot of it came from there. And John Money, it also goes back further in Germany to the 1890s or the early 1900s. But John Money did an experiment on two boys because he was very interested in this whole field. And they were the Reimer twins. Or I can't remember if they were twins or brothers. I think they were twins. One of them had a botched circumcision where they used, I think, the diathermy, which burns blood vessels, but they burnt off most of his penis. So somehow the parents consulted John Money, this psychologist from New Zealand, and he suggested that they raise the child as a girl, which they did. I think they called him Brenda, and all was, apparently fine, according to John Money, who was also doing awful experiments with them where he was exposing them to pornography and encouraging them to get into sexual positions with each other and pretend to have sex. The guy was seriously disturbed and dangerous. Anyway, the ultimate result of all of this was that when the affected brother decided that things weren't going well and found out that he really was a boy, he was absolutely devastated. And he knew that something was wrong. He knew he wasn't a girl. And he ultimately ended up committing suicide. And so did the other brother. It just devastated their lives. And yet, this is like the test case for gender transition. This is treated as if it's a great success story. And it just boggles the mind. It was a complete disaster for the family, for the two brothers, and yet it's treated as if it's a great success story that proves gender identity exists and that gender transition is a very effective treatment for anyone who may be confused about their identity, has gender dysphoria, or for some reason, as in this case, had a problem with their genitals being damaged as a baby.
And think
Basically,
about the outcomes. Yeah. Jenny, is right that those two Reimer brothers, respectively, they killed themselves. So yes, there's some outcomes for you. Those that push this myth, this scam, this scheme, they don't want anybody talking about the sexual deviance of John Money.
Right.
That he was, what amounts to, he was perping on these kids. If you have kids that are in session enacting sex acts, you're perping on them. You'll be arrested, by the way, right? That's a mandated report in and of itself. So the entire house of cards is built upon a fraudulent foundation that nobody wants to examine the foundation, and we will, little by little. We're going to unpack that. We're going to have additional guests on as we unpack this. Jenny, I want to, since you are a registered nurse, and therefore your background is not just clinical in terms of psychotherapy, but also medical, talk to parents, give them a brief overview of what is the medicalization process. There's a couple of different things that they can be guaranteed if their child or children begin to, quote unquote, transition. And there's social transition. What does that look like? They start to dress androgynously, or for boys, they start to dress a little more feminine, in a more feminine, traditionally feminine fashion. It's not going to stop there. So eventually there's going to be the push to introduce pharmaceuticals and procedures. So as a professional that's trained within the medical field as a registered nurse, inform parents, but if they've heard about blockers, they've heard about cross-sex hormones, and then top surgery, bottom surgery, paint the picture, clarify for the parents or grandparents that are listening, or some of the young people that may not know what's in store for them. If they get on this moving sidewalk, what are the stages? Talk about transitions. What are the stages? And where's this going to dump them out on? And what are they going to look like? If they go through with full transitioning, what happens to their body?
Right. All right. Well, we'll start with social transition, because that can start as early as 3 years old. And some of the activist doctors recommend that if your child, is a boy and he points to something pink, he's trying to tell you that he's really a girl, even if he's a baby, even if he's 2, 3 years old. So the trouble with social transition is it's not a neutral intervention. And the Cass review of the Tavistock Clinic, Hilary Cass, who reviewed that, said that it's not a neutral intervention. It is a very drastic intervention because you're cementing or concretizing an idea, a feeling, a fantasy. You're making it real. So, and what happens is that that child will almost invariably go on to puberty blockers. Now, you can understand that because you're treating a girl as a boy or a boy as a girl, and you're also letting them know, and other people will let them know, that puberty's coming up, and this is a terrifying time when you won't be able to be your so-called authentic self. So they create this extreme fear of a natural process, puberty, which in point of actual fact helps people with gender dysphoria, and that's been proven through 4 decades of research. But they create this terrible fear of puberty, which is easy to do, especially with later on with girls who are prone to eating disorder behaviours and personalities. They're already terrified of puberty. So what happens is once you socially transition your child, the chance of them going on to medicalisation is over 90%. It's very, very high. So then they're going to end up on puberty blockers, very likely. Now, the trouble with puberty blockers is, first of all, like I said, they block a process that would have helped the child, and they also block a natural maturational process, including blocking natural brain development, blocking natural sexual organ development, blocking proper bone development. So the consequences, I'll just look at my list of the consequences of puberty blockers, are things like osteoporosis, early osteoporosis. So there's a boy in Sweden who was featured in a documentary called Transition Train, and he has such terrible pain. He's only 13, or he might be 15. He's got terrible pain in his back because he's got osteoporosis, and he's prone to fractures. He has trouble walking. So osteoporosis is something that usually older women get over 60. And older men occasionally. Why would we want to give that to teenagers, young people? It's a terrible condition that increases your risk of very serious side effects like fracturing your hip, etc. Then we've also got problems like I said, cognitive dysfunction. The brain isn't developing properly. And Professor John Whitehall, a paediatrician here in Australia, has proven that when you give these drugs to sheep, their brains don't develop properly and they can't find their way around a field that normally they would have no problem finding their way around. They also increase the risk of mental health problems. So the puberty blockers themselves appear to increase the risk of self-harm and suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviour. And they, of course, increase the risk that you're going to go on to cross-sex hormones, because once you're on puberty blockers, there's a very high, super high, like over 95, 98% chance that you will go on to cross-sex hormones.
Jenny, we're up against time.
Right.
Let's hold that thought, because we're going, and you stay right there. We're going to continue in part 2. We'll pick up right where we've left off with you, with your medical background. You're going to continue describing if parents begin to administer these to their kids or allow the administration of these puberty blockers take place, then we're going to go on to cross-sex hormones. We haven't even gotten to that horror story. And then the surgeries. We're going to pick that up on part 2 of this interview. Are you okay staying with us for that?
Of course, no problem.
So, Brad, thank you again. And we look forward to picking up where we're leaving off right now. Jenny Kyng from Tasmania.